How far have we come in the last 30 years? Can't expect too much if we're talking 45 to, say, 70. It's understandable that that took time to develop anything like a movement with the institutions you need and so forth. You didn't have the think tanks. You didn't have the mailing list developed. Not until Viguerie and after the 1964 election began to assemble political mailing lists did you have any real systematic attempt to mobilize people. So let's go with areas in which there has been a strong conservative view, which supposedly millions of people have agreed on certain policy issues, and see how well we've done. Starting with the most divisive of the issues, Roe v. Wade, that is legalization of abortion. On that issue, within the conservative movement, there has been agreement in the past that it should be repealed if it could be repealed. It should be overturned, and yet no one knows how to overturn it. Nobody believes it's going to be done by the courts, and the question is, how do you do it by constitutional amendment? Could that pass? And the difficulty there is every time that there's another abortion, family members tend to say, well, I guess it can't be all that bad because Jenny Sue just got an abortion. And so 3, 4, 5 people are convinced that, well, maybe it wasn't so bad after all. And every time there's an abortion, you increase the number of people who are willing to accept the morality of the position. So how do you reverse that? Has there been any success with overturning Roe v. Wade? No. Is there any organized political party or organized political movement that offers any real help in terms of a constitutional amendment, either to overturn Roe v. Wade or return the power to make the decision back to the states? No. The anti-abortion movement really has almost disappeared. In the last 10 years, it has generally faded. I'm sure there are people sending out letters, and there's still groups trying to get it changed, but it's not a front page issue of the press. It's not talked about widely in conservative circles. You don't hear talk radio talk about abortion. And yet of all the issues that conservatives should say we've got to solve that problem, that's the one that we haven't solved. Okay, next issue. Where have we been rolled back over and over and over? Issue of the public schools, tax funding of schools. That didn't exist at the time of the foundation of the country. That only began to come into existence in the 1830s and 40s and came into existence in Massachusetts, spread out. And it was not that widely popular. And in any case, lots of people in the South didn't have them. Lots of people were tutored. The public schools become a major institution after the Civil War and really in the great cities with the arrival of millions of immigrants. And Americans say, how are you going to make them Americans? And the answer was, well, let's put them in a government-funded school system. That's how we're going to make Americans. And so the public schools became an agency of Americanization, or so we thought. The public schools became an agency of transformation morally, or so we thought. Public schools were going to reduce crime. The public schools were going to remake man. But it didn't happen. And yet, how close are we to shutting down the public schools? Well, in inner cities, they're shutting them down, but only because the money has run out. They plan to shut them down or consolidate them in Kansas City, Missouri. Now we're told that in Detroit, they're going to consolidate the schools, just close them down. There's no more money. But those are the inner cities. And we've kind of written off the inner cities. And we've kind of written off the public schools in the inner cities. But masses of people are not yet pulling their children out of the public schools in the suburbs. There people say, well, it can't be too bad. Well, it's not that bad yet. Well, ours is not too bad. Now, the textbooks are all about the same because they're produced in New York, and they're bought by public school screening committees all across the country. And if you can get it through Texas, Illinois, California, and New York, if you can get it through the screening committees of those states, and basically Texas is the hardcore one. If you can get it through Texas, you can tell the kid anything if you can get it through Texas. Now, Texas is the hardcore case because a pair of conservative Christian parents decided that they'd fight it. Mel and Norma Gabler, they decided 30 years ago they would fight it. Actually, over 30 years now, closer to 35, early 70s. They decided they would fight it, and they have made a strong stand. They're both dead now, but they made a strong stand to block the worst of the textbook examples of the left that were presented to the Texas Screening Committee, and there is a board screening committee that's elected, and they were successful in blocking the worst of it. But that's only the worst of it. It doesn't block most of it. So if the textbooks are virtually all the same nationally, and the government regulation on who gets the money is the same, and the labor union demands are the same, then they're the same. Don't tell me your public school is different in terms of the content. It may just be different in terms of the performance of the student. And in any case, if the school has a winning football team, probably it's not going to get criticized too much. At the National Affairs Briefing Conference, 1980, when all the assembled conservative Christians came out, I spoke to about 5,000 people. It's the largest group I ever spoke to. And I remember making the statement in Texas. I said, if every Bible-believing Christian in Texas pulled his kid out of the public schools on Monday, the public schools would be busted by Wednesday. And that was true then, it's true now. But they don't do it. So in that area, the K through 12 schools, where have been the successes? Well, there are some day schools, not too many. There is a homeschool movement, and it's spreading, but it doesn't compete in terms of numbers with the public schools. For all of the criticism and all of the complaints through my entire adult lifetime and even back to my teenage years, for all the complaints about the public schools, they're worse. And are they more expensive? Yes. And do the kids perform as well? No. SAT scores have fallen. They had to revise the SAT scores to make it look as though they hadn't fallen. So have we had a success in the public schools? No. How about the colleges? Well, there it's even worse. The same 24 schools that you had as potential institutions to send your children to get a vaguely Christian or vaguely conservative education in 1960 are the same schools today. A couple of dozen. Complete failure at the campus level. Complete failure. No example of a turnaround out there in the whole period. Now, what about conservative influence? Well, now that, on the fringes, yes, you'd say it's greater. The media have enabled us to get message out better. There's more communication. There has been some influence. But does it influence the way your county runs? Do you know who the members of your county commission are? You may know the name of your mayor. How much influence do conservatives, as conservatives, have at the county level of government? Almost none. And if it is an influence, it's more of a social conservative, not a principled conservatism. It's not an Adam Smith type conservatism. It might be a kind of good old boy conservatism, where you don't want too many flagrant examples of gangs moving in. You do something if you can to stop them. But in terms of what I would call conservative influence of ideas, almost no influence politically, even at the local level. And the higher up you go, the less influence there is. Now, what about the conservative leadership in the United States? Who are the conservative leaders today? Well, there's no figure politically at the national level that you would say is a plausible candidate for president. And that's not a bad thing, because the presidency is so hampered by bureaucracy and tradition and just the lack of time to change anything, that even if you can't elect a conservative president, you can at least slow it down. But how about Congress? Well, the number of congressmen who are really hardcore conservative people has always been limited. You had, in the 50s, you had Howard Buffett as a libertarian. In the 80s, 90s, into the present, you had Ron Paul, and that's it. You had a conservative like Larry McDonald. He was certainly conservative. I mean, he was a member of the John Birch Society. But he was taken out of action because of whatever happened to Korean Flight 007. And he disappeared as a political force. So you look, well, how about the senators? Who are the hardcore senators? Well, you don't have any hardcore senators that I know of. Jesse Helms was sort of it. You had Jesse Helms on the left, you had Ted on the right, you had Ted Kennedy on the left. I mean, they became the symbols for both sides. You could always raise money as a conservative writing about what Teddy Kennedy was about to do, and you could always raise money as a liberal writing about what Jesse Helms was about to do, but they're not with us anymore. So who are the lightning rods? Who are the symbols today of either liberalism or conservatism in the Senate? And you don't have anybody. 100 people there, you don't have anybody. On the left side, you have Nancy Pelosi in the House. You have a few conservatives, but again, who would you raise money for to run for president? Well, there's nobody there. You could run Ron Paul, but at his age, he's unlikely to be elected. So where's the leadership? Where's the political leadership? What are the alternatives? In 1999, Paul Weyrich wrote a letter to his supporters. Now, Paul Weyrich was a friend of mine. He gave a fine speech. He always got right to the point. He did not waffle. He was a man who could write very well, and he was a very practical guy in terms of organizing a political campaign. If Weyrich came in and would raise money for you at the congressional level, you had a good chance of winning. He was both ideologically consistent and practical in his use of time and money. He was uniquely gifted in that respect. In 1999, he wrote a letter, and he said, "We have lost the political battle." And he said, "We lost the political battle because we've lost the cultural battle." That the people, the broad mass of Americans, no longer agree with our values. He got a lot of criticism for this letter, and you can go onto the web and look for it. It's a very effective letter. There's almost nothing I wouldn't agree with. He said, well, we can build our families, and we can build schools outside the public school system. We can do what we can in our local community, in our local associations. I mean, this is almost classic Burkean philosophy. Localism, personal contacts, voluntary associations, classic Burkean politics. But he said, when you get to national politics, we cannot change the minds of the public now because the public no longer agrees with our sense of values. He was wise enough to understand that it is the confession of faith that men have that will determine the kind of politics that they have. He was not a leftist. He did not believe that you could transform mankind by gaining political power and then extending some kind of a system of transformation from the top down to the masses. That was foreign to his thinking. It's foreign to conservative thinking generally. Certainly it's foreign to Burkean conservative thinking. But then what do? How do you change the hearts of people? How do you change the moral commitment of people when the bulk of the time spent by those people will be, if they're teenagers, in the public schools reading public school textbooks or watching television at home, which is basically network television or maybe cable, or going to the movies for entertainment's sake? How do you change them? How do you get through to them when, in 1999, the system, in terms of the communication system, was rigged against us? Now today, we can say, well, there are ways of getting through, and that is YouTube, videos, PDFs, social media. There are many ways now that did not seem to be in existence in 1999, and yet they were in existence. We just didn't know how to exploit them. YouTube wasn't in existence, but email was in existence. Websites were in existence. It was possible to create an alternative curriculum. It's possible now to create whole digital online schools if you want to do that, and do it pretty cheaply. It's amazing technologically what's available, and it's getting better all the time. But Weyrich didn't see the technology of it. He saw the moral issue of it, and of course that was correct. Technology doesn't save people. But what technology does do is to enable everybody who's got a position to get that position out there, to persuade people. Persuasion is now possible. And it's low-cost persuasion compared to anything that was available to us as recently as 15 years ago. So this is a change. This is a major change. And it's international. And we have the spread of communications internationally, the likes of which we've never seen before. You have a development like Wikipedia, which has changed the way we learn. And even that story is one of the great stories. A young man was studying at Auburn University in Alabama. And he read something about an economist named Hayek. And he read again something about Mises and Hayek, and how Hayek believed that you had all of this knowledge decentralized, and if you could just pull that knowledge together institutionally, you could learn so much more than it was possible for any committee of even the brightest people in the world to learn. That was Hayek's great contribution. 1940s, he wrote about that. And he realized that there must be some connection between Hayek and Mises and this outfit across the street from the campus called the Mises Institute. So he walked across the street and he said, I want to do a paper on Hayek. Is there anybody here who can help me? And they directed him to an on-staff economist named Mark Thornton, and Thornton went through the basic Hayekian outlook on life, on how knowledge is transmitted and how knowledge is mobilized and how knowledge is decentralized. And he went back and he said, you know, I'll bet you could create an encyclopedia online like this. That was Jimmy Wales, and he did. And now that encyclopedia is international. That encyclopedia has got the division of labor. It has millions of entries. There's almost no topic for which there's not at least a preliminary wiki entry of some kind. And it's growing at an enormous rate. One guy getting one idea that said you don't need central planning to create an organization that can harness all the knowledge of literally millions of people out there who would be willing to contribute to this body of knowledge if you just have a way technologically of creating it, and that's what they did. Wiki will be here in 50 years. I think Wiki will be here in 100 years. I think Wiki is virtually a permanent institution. Now, if there's some way of making it more efficient, fine, they'll find a way to do that. But I can't see a better way of getting people to communicate knowledge in very specialized ways better than Wiki. And if there is a better way, then I'm sure it will be digital and somebody will find it. But certainly there's been such an enormous improvement of the communication of ideas since the founding of Wiki that it's almost inconceivable what took place. Nobody could have conceived that 10 years ago. But it could have been conceived, it just nobody did. It could have been conceived, but it took place at the right time because some young man was at the right campus to walk across the street to talk to the right professor about F.A. Hayek and Hayek's concept of decentralized knowledge. So again, the technology moves in our direction. The ability to produce a series of presentations like the one you're watching. You could have done that with film in 1955, but think of the expense. How would you market it? How could people afford it? Now you can put the whole thing out to the public, have an email out. I mean, you could even put the thing on YouTube at some point, if it's old enough, and people think that's the best way to communicate it. Well, you can't put it on YouTube now because it's a little long, but you can put it on some website. The point is you can get the ideas out. This was not possible before. But in terms of the impact of this position, it is as if none of this had taken place. In terms of the direct political influence that is shaping Congress today, it might as well be 1948 in terms of the number of principled people with an agenda in Congress, cooperating with each other, mobilizing the troops in the way that the left has been able to do it since the 1930s. It seems as though we are no better off today than we were in the 1940s, despite the fact that we have the web and we have video, we have low-cost books, we have homeschooling systems, we have all of these tremendous advantages. But where it counts, which is Congress and the school system and the courts, it seems as though we have made no progress. I think we have made progress. The volume of material out there is enormous. You can get it digitally. People can find it. There is Google. There are search engines. There are social media sites. It is different, and the potential is there to make fundamental changes. But we are back to Burke, and Burke tells us politics doesn't save. Politics won't save you. That was what he told his readers in 1790 about the French Revolution. Politics doesn't save. Politics doesn't heal. Politics, at best, keeps violence at bay and keeps fraud at bay, but it doesn't heal the soul. It doesn't transform the lives of men. To believe that it does is to go back to some form of Greek humanism. That's maybe popular in Athens in 400 BC, but it was not popular among conservatives in 1790. We've learned, as Burke would have told us, you're not going to change men based on political mobilization, political success. So where are we? We're seeing a loss of faith, and this loss of faith is comprehensive. People are losing faith in the institutions around them. There are very few institutions that seem to have real support by the general public. People have lost faith in churches. They've lost faith in the tax-funded school system. They surely have lost faith in Congress. They don't think much can be done by the president, which is true. You look at the institutions that normally supported people and normally gave them hope, and there's been a loss of faith. The idea of progress is being undermined. There was a long time when people believed that their children would do better than they did economically. Even that's fading. That's fading. Now, maybe it's not fading in China. It's surely not fading in India. But it's fading in the West. So if you don't trust the economy, and you don't trust the church, and you don't trust the schools, and you don't trust Congress, and you don't trust the president, and you think the TV is rotten, you don't really trust the TV with the reality shows, and you're not really convinced that you can trust the half hour of news, which isn't a half hour of news given all the ads, the 15 minutes of news you're going to get on the media, at least on the network media, who do you trust? Well, maybe people trust Limbaugh, but that's one man. If he has a heart attack, he's gone. You can trust some figure on Fox News, maybe. You think that's reliable. That only gives you information. It doesn't tell you what to do. That only tells you what's wrong. You don't get many stories about what's right. Certainly, the closer you get to the national media, the fewer of those stories that you get, because bad news sells. So where do people put their trust today? And how is that trust transformed into social change around them that is positive? Now, the liberal faces that problem too. The difference is he controls other people's money. He controls the university accreditation system. He controls the spending of state funding in the schools. He controls Congress. The liberal looks and says, okay, at least we have power. And yet the power is not being, in terms of their view, being used really to transform societies, and they can see that the main institutions on which they have relied for public support are losing that support. They're losing it. They're not blind, they can see that. The liberals wanted to have something comparable to Rush Limbaugh on the radio. They started Air America. There were going to be lots of clever and witty liberals to get on for talk radio. Well, Air America declared bankruptcy in January of 2010. Couldn't make it. The comedy channels, yes, okay, they do have audiences. And they're basically liberal, but boy, are they cynical. Are they cynical? It's all based on cynicism. You can laugh at the expense of the present social order. You can do the monologues in late night TV talking about the silliness of government politicians and the silliness and preposterous nature of society. You can laugh in a derisive form, and people do laugh. But that doesn't give you an alternative. You can't beat something with nothing. You can't beat something with nothing. And the left doesn't have something. And when they finally got something, which was the health care bill, 59% of the public opposed it, and they had to ram it through Congress to get it by the opposition of the general public. And that's what they do believe in, and the public doesn't believe it. So how do you build an alternative in the midst of a widespread lack of faith? And I'll be talking about that in the next section.